The chains on my wrists were made of woven starlight alloy, the kind the Kethrani Empire reserved for enemies of the throne. They didn't hurt, they hummed. Every time I moved, the hum got louder, like the metal itself was reminding me what I was. A deserter, a coward, a stain on the uniform I used to wear with pride. 2 Kethrani honor guards marched me down the obsidian corridor toward the throne room, their 4 eyes each fixed forward, never once glancing at us. Guards weren't supposed to look at Traitor. It was beneath. My name is Corporal Ethan Vance, and 6 months ago I was the only human attached to the 3rd Kethrani Expeditionary Fleet, serving as a tactical liaison under the Voluntary Species Integration Accord. Humanity had signed that accord 9 years earlier, after the Kethrani Empire discovered us, sized us up, and decided we were useful enough to fold into their war machine instead of useful enough to conquer. We were the newest species in a 200-year-old empire, and every human serving under Kethrani command knew the unspoken rule. Prove your worth or prove their suspicions right. I proved something 6 months ago, just not what they thought. The doors to the throne room were 40 feet tall, carved from black stone quarried from a dead moon, and they opened without a sound. That silence was worse than any creak. It meant the room beyond had swallowed noise the way it was about to swallow me. Empress Shvaineth Itolar sat upon the obsidian seat, and even after 2 years in Kethrani space, the sight of her still stopped my breath. She was 9 feet of coiled violet-black scale and starlight-pale eyes, wrapped in a war mantle stitched from the banners of conquered fleets. She had ruled for 40 Kethrani cycles, nearly 90 human years, and in that time she had never once been wrong about a traitor, until now, though she didn't know that yet. "Corporal Ethan Vance," she said. Her translator drone rendered her voice flat and cold, but I'd spent enough time around the key, Kethrani, to hear the fury underneath it, vibrating in frequencies the machine couldn't fully catch. "Do you know why you stand before me instead of before a military tribunal?" "No, Your Radiance." I kept my eyes down, the way protocol demanded. My heart was doing its best to escape through my rib. "Because a military tribunal executes deserters in an afternoon," she said. "I wanted more time with you than that." The honor guards forced me to my knees. The starlight chains hummed louder, tightening slightly, like they were tasting my fears. 6 months ago," the Empress continued, "you were assigned to the forward listening post on Threll Station, monitoring rebel Voskal fleet movements along the Ashen Rim. 2 days into your rotation, station security logs show you disabling your tracking beacon, stealing a 2-person shuttle, and fleeing into rebel-held space. You were listed as killed in action until a Voskal defector, captured 3 weeks ago, revealed that you had been living quite comfortably among our enemies, feasting at their tables, advising their commanders. Every word she said was true. That was the terrible, beautiful joke of it. I have executed generals for less, she said. I have executed my own bloodline for less. And yet, she leaned forward and the war mantle rustled like dry leaves over a grave. "There is the matter of the note." My chest tightened. "When my recovery team finally retook Threll Station 8 weeks ago," she said, "they found your quarters exactly as you left, untouched, as if you expected someone to walk in and read what you left behind." Her pale eyes narrowed to slits. "A single data chip, sealed with your biometric signature, sitting on your cot like a gift. My analysts have spent 2 months verifying it wasn't a trap, a virus, a weapon aimed at my command network." She raised one taloned hand, and a guard stepped forward carrying a small obsidian tray. On it sat the data chip, the very one I'd left behind on Threll Station, 6 months and 1 lifetime. "It is not a trap," she said. "It is worse. It is a confession, and I intend to hear every word of it from your own mouth before I decide whether your execution will be quick, or a lesson for every human who ever considers following your example." I lifted my head. For the first time since the guards dragged me in, I met her eyes directly, a crime punishable by flogging under normal circumstances. She didn't strike me down, she was waiting. "Then let me tell you what really happened on Threll Station," I said. "Because your analysts verified the chip wasn't a weapon, they didn't tell you what it actually contains, did they?" Something flickered behind her starlight eyes. Not quite doubt, not yet, but a crack thin as a hair. "In 90 years of absolute certainty." "Speak," she said. "And Vance, choose your next words as if they are your last, because for you they may well be." Threll Station wasn't glamorous duty. It was a rust-scared relay platform bolted to an asteroid on the edge of the Ashen Rim, staffed by 11 Kethrani technicians, 4 Voskal language specialists, and me, the token human, there because Fleet Command wanted integration optics more than they wanted my actual skill. I didn't mind. Quiet duty meant time to think, And I used that time to actually read the intelligence reports instead of just filings. That was my mistake, or maybe my salvation, depending on how you looked at it. 3 days into my rotation, I found the anomaly. The Voskal rebellion had been bleeding the Kethrani Empire dry for 11 years. Not because they were stronger, but because they were smarter about where they hit. Supply convoys, communication relays, never anything that would provoke total annihilation. Always something that would keep the war expensive and endless. Standard insurgency doctrine. I'd studied it back on Earth, in a different war, against a different empire that also thought it couldn't lose. But the strike patterns didn't match insurgency doctrines. Somebody was feeding the Voskal precise fleet movement data that only existed on encrypted Kethrani command channel, data that, according to the access logs, only a handful of people could have touched. One of those people was Fleet Marshal Kesarath Dunn, the Empress's own cousin, and the man overseeing the entire Ashen Rim campaign. I brought my findings to my direct superior, a Kethrani lieutenant named Thesk. He listened, he nodded, and 3 hours later my quarters were quietly searched, my personal logs quietly copied, and a very polite, very final transfer arrived reassigning me to a reconnaissance position that every human liaison I asked about went pale describing. It was a graveyard. People sent there didn't file complaints. They just stopped filing anything. Thesk hadn't reported the fleet marshal. He'd reported me. That's when I understood the trap I was standing in. If I stayed, I'd disappear into a reconnaissance post and die quietly, and the leak would continue, and the war would continue, and thousands more Kethrani and human soldiers would keep dying to feed somebody's private profit or private treason. If I went up the chain further, I had no proof Thesk hadn't already altered, and no reason to think the next officer up wouldn't just be another link in Kesarath Dunn's chain. A fleet marshal, who was the Empress's own blood, had resources I couldn't outmaneuver from inside the system. So I stopped playing inside the system. I disabled my tracking beacon. I stole the 2-person shuttle, and I flew directly into Voskal space. Into the heart of the enemy, the Kethrani Empire had spent 11 years failing to understand. Because the one thing 11 years of insurgency data told me was that the Voskal weren't fighting to destroy the Empire. They were fighting because something inside the Empire had made destruction look like the only option left to them. And if that was true, the leak wasn't really the Voskal's victory. It was Kesarath Dunn's insurance policy, a war he was making sure never ended. Because an endless war meant nobody ever looked too closely at where the profits were going, or who they belonged to. I needed proof no Kethrani officer could bury, and the only place that proof could come from was the enemy who'd been receiving it. Getting the Vosaskale to trust a human deserter took 11 days, 4 bruised ribs, and 1 very long night convincing their war council that I hadn't been sent to assassinate anyone. What finally worked wasn't a speech, it was data. I handed over 3 of my own old surveillance logs, worthless, outdated, nothing that could hurt the Empire, as a show of good faith, and I asked, bluntly, for the truth about where their intelligence had really been coming from. Commander Railthis, the Voskal officer, who eventually decided not to space me, laughed the first time I asked. It wasn't a happy sound. "You want to know who is feeding us your Empire's secrets?" she said, translator crackling through her mandibles. "Human, we have been asking that question for 4 years. We stopped caring where the gifts came from once they started saving our lives. That was the thread I pulled. 4 years, not 11. The Voskal rebellion had survived on its own wits and its own blood for the first 7 years of the war, and only in the last 4 had someone started handing them exactly enough intelligence to keep the fighting alive without ever letting either side win. It took another 5 months of careful, patient, terrifying work, building trust one verified piece of information at a time, cross-referencing every rebel raid against every leaked command files, tracing payment routes through 3 shell companies and 1 deeply corrupt Kethrani logistics contract before I had it. A complete financial and communications trail connecting Fleet Marshal Kesarath Dunn to a private arms syndicate that had been selling captured Kethrani military technology to both sides of the war, using the endless conflict as cover for a decade of profiteering that would have made even Earth's worst war profiteers blush. Kesarath Dunn wasn't losing the war to the Voskal. He was farming it. By the time I had the proof, I also had something I hadn't expected to find. The beginning of a peace. Not a treaty, not yet. But Railthis and I had spent 5 months talking between the missions, the close calls, the long nights, waiting for extraction plans that never quite worked out. And somewhere in that time, the human deserter and the rebel commander had started drafting, quietly, off the records, the outline of terms the Voskal might actually accept if the war's true architect were ever exposed. I couldn't deliver that proof to Fleet Marshal Kesareth Dunn's chain of command. I couldn't deliver it to Lieutenant Thesk, who'd already sold me out once for far less. There was exactly one person in the entire Kethrani Empire with the authority to act on it, the power to survive the political fallout of arresting her own cousin. And I gambled everything on this, the will to actually do it, the Empress. But I had no way to reach her, not as a fugitive with a bounty on his head and a confirmed Kie status that made me a ghost in every Kethrani database. So I did the only thing left. I recorded everything, the evidence, the financial trails, the communications intercepts, Raelthis' own testimony, and the outline of peace terms we'd built together onto a single data chip. I sealed it with my own biometric signature, so no one could claim it had been planted or forged. And I left it on my cot at Threll Station, in the one place I knew Kethrani recovery teams would eventually search, once the station was retaken. Then I did the second hardest thing I've ever done. I let myself get captured by a very specific, very talkative Voskal officer, who I knew would eventually be taken prisoner in a raid I'd helped Raelthis plan to look survivable, but costly enough to be believable. I let him carry the story of the comfortable human traitor back to Kethrani space, because a defector's rumor was the only bait that would eventually drag me in front of the one person who could act on what I'd left behind. I bet my life that the Empress would want to look her supposed traitor in the eye before killing him. I was right. Silence hung in the throne room after I finished. The Empress hadn't moved once during my account, her pale eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made the chains around my wrists feel like the least dangerous thing in the room. "You are asking me to believe," she said slowly, "that you sacrificed your rank, your reputation, and very nearly your life, on the chance that I would personally read a data chip left on an abandoned cot." "No, Your Radiance," I said. "I'm not asking you to believe anything. Your analysts already verified the chip is real. All I did was tell you why it exists." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she gestured, and the guard holding the tray stepped forward and inserted the chip into a reader built into the arm of the obsidian seat. A holographic display bloomed in the air above it. Financial ledgers, comm intercepts, a face I recognized as Fleet Marshal Kesareth Dunn, overlaid with a decade of transaction records that even I, watching for the second time, found genuinely sickening. The Empress read in silence for 11 minutes. I counted every one of them. When she finally looked up, something in her posture had changed. The fury was still there, but it had found a new target, and it wasn't kneeling in chains. And "My cousin has profited from Kethrani blood for 10 years, she said, and her voice, even through the translator, carried a weight that made the honor guards flinch. "While I executed loyal officers for the crime of losing battles he arranged for them to lose. Yes, Your Radiance, and you." She rose from the obsidian seat, and 9 feet of violet-scaled fury descended the dais steps until she stood directly over me. "You could have brought me suspicion. Instead, you brought me a decade of proof, a defector's testimony." And she gestured at the holograms, where the outline of peace terms still glowed faintly at the file's end. "The beginning of an end to a war that never needed to be fought at all. I couldn't trust anyone in the chain of command not to bury it, Your Radiance. So I went around the chain entirely." "You went around my entire empire," she said, "and gambled that I would rather know an uncomfortable truth than execute a comfortable lie." "Yes, for the first time in 90 years of rule, according to every soldier I ever spoke to afterward. Empress Shavaneth," I told her, "no, not to me, to the chains around my wrists," which she unlocked herself with a small ceremonial key drawn from her war mantle. "Corporal Ethan Vance," she said, loud enough for every guard, every attendant, every recording drone in that vast obsidian room to hear. "You are no deserter. You are the first officer in the history of this empire to be tried for treason and found guilty of nothing but loyalty too large for the chain of command to contain." The chains fell away. The hum died. For the first time in 6 months, my wrists were just my wrists. "Fleet Marshal Kesareth Dunn will answer for a decade of engineered war," she continued. "And the Voskal Rebellion will receive an emissary within the week to discuss the terms you and Commander Raelthis began drafting between missions. You will accompany that emissary, Corporal, because you are the only being on either side of this war both sides currently trust." I opened my mouth to say something appropriately humble, and instead what came out was, "Does that mean I'm getting my rank back, Your Radiance?" The Empress's mandibles clicked in what I'd learned, after 2 years among the Kethrani, was the closest thing to a laugh her species allowed itself in public. "Corporal," she said, "I am giving you a great deal more than your rank back. The war didn't end that day. Wars like that never do. There were still fleets to recall, profiteers to root out, a decade of engineered hatred on both sides that no single peace conference could unmake overnight. But 6 months later, when the formal armistice was signed between the Kethrani Empire and the Voskal Rebellion, it was signed on Threll Station, the same rust-scared relay platform where I'd once left a data chip on an empty cot and gambled everything on the hope that the truth, given time, would find someone strong enough to act on it. Commander Railthis stood on one side of the signing table. I stood on the other, in a fresh uniform with my rank restored, and a new title nobody in Kethrani military history had ever held before, Ambassador of Voluntary Truth, a rank the Empress had invented, specifically because, in her words, no existing title accounted for a soldier who deserted his post to save an empire that had already sentenced him to die for it. Humanity, it turned out, hadn't just proven itself useful to the Kethrani war machine. We'd proven we were willing to burn our own reputations to the ground for the sake of a truth nobody else was brave enough to go looking for. And in an empire 200 years old, built on obedience and hierarchy and the quiet assumption that the chain of command was always right, that turned out to be worth more than any weapon we could have brought them.